get in
We
trouble.
should mark so people can
You
see
fire
that
you?
on attendance.
This
I don't
week is
know.
already ended, because this, next week is the last
That may send me to
Sunday.
purgatory.
And that's the first Sunday.
Oh, that's right,
So
for the
it's,
next.
he just needs to write in a class on
Okay.
December 3rd. And then the
No.
24th is also a Sunday,
Yeah.
but they'll probably do a joint
I'm
Sunday
sure
school
they
class
will.
that
And
Friday
probably the
too.
following Sunday with,
Yeah, that's gonna be odd. I probably won't come, because I've got an usher at the, one of the later services.
Right, I mean, I'm
Evening,
here
so-
for all 5 services, so
Oh,
you know
gosh.
it, because I
I'm
don't
sorry.
pay that much.
Got a usher?
But it's gonna be the 24th, I don't know if they will say no other Sunday school classes, or if they're gonna do
Right.
a joint, so there may be 2 Sundays in
usually
December.
some Sundays.
They put it in the bulletin too. Okay, so
The 20th is before the 24th.
the thing where we are right now, if you remember, the Logos to Telos of Hebrews is how do you enter God's rest? And so we went from probably, I would consider it not a simplistic argument. It wasn't a simple argument, but it was an argument basically talking about, you know, in general the sacrifice, in general the priesthood, etc. But we saw the problem well, maybe we didn't see the problem. There is a problem that exists with this. Because from the Greek standpoint, and you remember this document is written to Greeks. I think it's written in Greek, so it's primarily Greeks. It's written to the Romans. We can see that in the text. It's written to the Jews, especially the diaspora Jews, and I think it's additionally written to the Egyptians, which are, at this time, Egyptians are the Greek.
Oh, no.
Right.
Yeah. You got a meld of the Greek or the Egyptian view. What happens is, well, you know what happens with every culture, right, in society. The Greeks came down to take over the Egyptians, and they weren't practicing the Assyrian method, the original Assyrian method, which was not super effective. That's where you take the whole population to your home to become your slaves. That's what the Assyrians did. The problem is,
Then you get watered down.
yeah, your population gets watered down, and suddenly, you know, you're voting out the rulers or whatever, you know, and you're toast. So then they went and tried the Babylonian method. The Babylonian method is you go and get the leadership. You take the leadership home. That was good for the Babylonians. It actually worked pretty effectively. The problem, though, you get, they become assimilated and they become the leadership. And that's what happened to the Babylonians, right? And eventually they can, well, what happened, right? What happened in the Old Testament? The leadership of the Babylonians, which were the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, convinced the Babylonian, or the following king, the king of Damascus, the king of, what's that?
Cyrus.
Yeah, Cyrus, to do what?
Send them back.
Let 'em go back.
To send them home. Yeah, because they became such key members or units, and they convinced them quite rightly, which I don't know if that was good for Babylon or if it was good for whoever, but we did get the Babylonian Talmud out of it. Huge things happening. The other method that the Greeks used, what was the Greek method?
Let things stay where they were, as long as they weren't a problem, they weren't rebellious.
Yeah. Basically, it was an interesting method, and it worked actually very well under Hellenization. The problem with Hellenization, though, was what happened to the Romans eventually. But in a Hellenized society, the Greeks brought their culture, and what happened to everybody that they went and colonized? Yeah. Well, they wanted to be Greek, right? There's lots of reasons. You can go back to say, okay, your gods are better because you won. Well, also they had a huge, sophisticated society. Well, you saw the same thing, right, in the British Empire, right? The British Empire, wherever it went, people wanted to speak English. People wanted to learn about British history. They had British schools. The whole thing happened, and you saw a civilization of the world. The problem with the Romans loved Greek culture. They thought Greek culture was the greatest thing. The only problem was what? They took in the Greek culture, and they basically absorbed the Greek culture but missed out on something the Greeks had. The Romans had this thing going. They were great engineers. They take the Greek ideas. The Greeks never did it. The Greeks had it on paper.
Talked about it.
They talked a lot about it. Yeah, they talked about it all day, but they never did it. So the Romans took their stuff and they went and did it. The problem was that when you mix some of the Roman with the Greek ideas, what did you end up with? You know, the Romans who were out for doxa suddenly became interested in arena, in philosophy, peace and philosophy. Remember peace in the Greek word means joining. It means to join. And so eventually you water down your culture and society to the point that you're no longer able to protect your borders or protect yourself. And that's, in large measure, there's other things that happened in the Roman Empire, but you can see how cultures influence cultures and affect cultures, and then we get to where we are. Now, the problem for the Jews, the Greeks were very happy with this idea of Jesus Christ being a sacrifice. They were really happy with the idea of Jesus being a priest and a sacrifice. That's this meta-epithumia idea. The meta-epithumia of Christ as the sacrifice reaching to God and God reaching down. And of course, Christ is God and God is Christ. This is great for the Greeks. The Greeks love this. This is philosophy. There is a problem that I have, though. What is the problem? For the Jews especially.
Christ wasn't a Levite.
Christ was not a Levite. Christ was not a son of Aaron, and therefore he wasn't supposed to be a high priest. So if he wasn't a high priest, he can't do the sacrifice. So to the Jews, the logical stumbling block for the Jews is Jesus is not a Levite. He's not an Aaronite. He's not from the house of Aaron. He can't be a high priest. He's from which household? Judah, and he is a king, right? So there's a problem. You remember the Maccabees solved the problem. They just said, well, we'll kill you if you say funny, right? I mean, it's a 1984 solution. The problem for the Greeks, though, what do you think the problem for the Greeks in this whole picture is? What do the Greeks love?
A good argument.
A good argument in philosophy. So who has the best argument in terms of Christ?
Christians.
Huh?
Christians.
In this stack. These are Tinotos. Right? Who has the best philosophy in terms of Christ, or logical argument in terms of Christ in this group?
Okay, the Jews.
The Jews. So, if you're Greek, whose argument are you going to go from? The Jewish argument, right? Because that's the one that exists. So what problem now do the Greeks have?
That Christ is not a priest.
Yeah, and you know what? Look, people, they knew this. How do I know? Look at the Maccabees. Don't look at the Maccabees. Look at Josephus, and look at who's the guy? Not Theodocles. The guy starts with an H. Herodotus. Look at Herodotus, because he says, and I believe I got the right guy. Herodotus writes about the Jews, and he says that the Jews had works of antiquity that the Greeks thought were amazing, because they were older than any Greek document. So the Greeks were astounded that the Jewish people had these works of antiquity. They weren't unknown to them. See? As a matter of fact, we know what happened in 275 BC.
Alexander the Great?
He's before that.
Oh.
This is when we had
Oh, the Septuagint.
the Septuagint, the LXX. I don't know if it's the very first time some book was translated from one language to another. A huge document or library was translated from one language to another. Remember, I told you, the average library had how many books? 2 or 3. The big ones had maybe 7, you know? Yes, sir.
The concept that only priests could come from Levites, is that biblical, or is that just something made up by man somewhere?
That's totally biblical, and it was you had to be Aaron from the house of Aaron to be a priest, but you had to be a Levite. The Levites were the keepers of the temple, and matter of fact, the Levites weren't given a land. They don't have land because their whole job was to take care of the temple, right? Which we know, interesting things happened in the diaspora because who had some land, right? Old Zechariah went from his land, right, near Bethlehem, out to work the temple. Yes, sir.
But did God say that, or was that just the tradition that has?
No, God said that.
No, God
And-
told, it instructed Moses to divide up the blah, blah, blah.
I haven't taught the Torah in a long time. We should go back and teach the Torah because if you remember Torah class, that was way a long time. Was it 10 years ago? The Torah class that I had, we went through the Torah and we saw all the sacrificial stuff and all the commandments, all the things that were specifically in that. And one of the things we talked about was, yeah, the Levites were given this responsibility they were not given land. They were given the responsibility of the temple and the responsibility of the faith, I guess. It's not really
and the
faith.
moving tabernacle and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, they moved the tabernacle, they controlled the tabernacle, and the Aarons, the only priests could be from the tribe of Aaron. Now, here's the interesting thing. Remember Zechariah? He was also a relative, or he was related to Christ. Now, we don't know precisely or exactly how he was related to Christ, but his wife, Elizabeth, was a cousin to Mary. Okay, a cousin. So there's some connection there, but you see that connection wasn't as important as a connection that our author's trying to give us. So where we went, or where we're from, is the authors of Hebrews told us that the meta-epithumia and the Greeks are happy with this. I think to a degree the Jews are happy with this idea of the meta-epithumia, the concept of the endless scent of the sacrifice, and the scent of the sacrifice being Christ, right? The problem we have is Christ being the sacrifice and giving the sacrifice as the high priest. So how can he be high priest? And that's what we're discussing in Melchizedek, the concept of Melchizedek. I'll just kind of give you a reminder. Here's the words of the day. Choris. Choris. And Choris, I gave you the notes here. The reason I threw this word in is because we're going to see it a bunch of times. The word is translated usually space, or look what the King James translated as. King James gives you beside, by itself, and without. Okay. The word choris, as you see, comes from the word chasma. And chasma means a chasm, right? And, you know, it also means to gape or yawn. So they could yawn, a chasm, a vacancy, possible interval. It gives you the idea of an empty space or expanse of room. What I'm trying to point out to you is the word that's translated beside, by, and itself, and without has a huge and deep meaning to it. It's almost like this meta-epithumia that is, means literally the infinite line of the sacrifice, sense of the sacrifice from man to God, and yet it's translated as pleasant or good. How can we live with that, right? So this word, I wanted to see it because we're going to see it multiple times as we go through this argument about Melchizedek. The other one here is really fun because this is one of our kind of favorite things we can do with Greek. I'll put a K there. A-T-O-U-N. Apo. Apo. Decatud. Apodectud. Oh, cool. What a word. This word means a tenth. A tenth. And you can see that declensions comes from deca, which means 10. So it's the relation is to be a tenth. And apo means off, so participle. So off tenth, or off, we would say off tithe. I want to re-establish or re-mention for the tithe. Before we get into this, the thing you've got to remember about a tithe. Okay, here's your usual view. I take my tithe to the church or to the temple, right? And I give it to the priests, and the priests do what with it?
Use it.
They put it in the temple, according to Malachi, according to our mistranslation of Malachi, they put it in the storehouse. Well, if you read Malachi properly, as we did before we studied Malachi, we found that God was cursing them for doing that. Because what is supposed to happen with the tithe, and I taught this back in the Torah class, if you read the Torah class, you take your tithe to the temple. Matter of fact, you can turn your tithe into money, so then when you get to the temple, you turn it back into food, animal, things, drink, liquor, okay? Because when you take your tithe to the temple, the priests cook it and sacrifice it. Because the tithe is one of the, we have the sacrifice, right? We have the ascension sacrifice, the sin, the guilt, the priest sacrifice, and the Thanksgiving sacrifice. The Thanksgiving sacrifice is the tithe. The tithe is shared. It's a shared meal. It's a shared thing. So when you bring the tithe to the temple, the whole purpose is that the priests kill it, sacrifice it, and you eat it together. Guess what we call that today? Communion Eucharist. This is what Communion Eucharist has become within the context. And if Paul had won, we would have a Seder with lamb, and we'd all be fat, because we'd be eating all kinds of good food, you know, every time we did a communion in church. So when we read this, we have to remember this within this context. As a matter of fact, I'll even go further. The purpose of the tithe and the Thanksgiving sacrifice equals what kind of meal? It's a covenant meal. Remember the covenant meal that Abram and God had together? Abram and God made the covenant with Abraham. He took the animals and he chopped them in two, and they walked between them. And everybody says, well, that's kind of funny stuff. But what did they do afterwards? They cooked them and ate them. Because a covenant meal, when you make a covenant, when you have a covenant, and guess what they were doing with the tithe? They were renewing their covenant with God. And so in the covenant meal, the tithe is sacrificed and you eat it. And by the way, okay, do I have to say this? All right, I know that people get funky about this, but Jesus Christ was the sacrifice, and therefore in the Eucharistic meal, we symbolically eat his body and blood, right? Because he is a sacrifice. This comes from really deep things. And by the way, okay, now we don't do it, but a Catholic priest, an Orthodox priest, the Anglicans do it. They take the wafer and they break it. And they separate it, right? And the reason is because that symbolizes that the broken animal that you then walk between and you consume. It's covenant. It's a renewal of covenant. This is really, this is deep stuff. This is kind of thing where we take our knowledge of the Bible and we take our knowledge of historical facts and we take our knowledge of ancient cultures and we glom them together. Because if we can't, then we can't fully comprehend. And, Hebrews is difficult anyway. I'm sorry Hebrews is so difficult. I know it's difficult. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. I've gone to great lengths, more than even in my other classes, to try to make this a little more easy for us to understand. So, for example, here's what I tried to do. First, let's read it here's the King James Version. I'm in 4. Now consider how great this man was. This is Melchizedek, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the 10th of the spoils. So here's the Greek, and I gave you the Greek there. It's not just, it's de, it's but. But Pharaoh, be a spectator, not think, be a spectator. Pikulos, how much? He was added. Kai, and, not even, and, patriarchs, Abraham gave, Didomai, gave him, that's added, an ek from the plunder. Basically, I don't know why I have ek there. Ek, primary preposition, meaning from. It's from. It's not tenth. It's from the plunder, the top of the heap. This is an interesting word too. acrothenia, I didn't give it to you because it's a pretty simple word, but, and I don't know what to explain about this, but you know, what is the top of the heap? Did they put the lesser value things on the bottom of the heap and then have the more expensive stuff on the top? I don't know. I don't know if it's a saying. It could be a figure of speech in Greek. I'm not sure. I didn't look at my figure of speech in Greek book. I have a book that lists all the figures of speech in Greek, but I'm not sure. But it's just an interesting idea. Here's what it says here's a translation of this that's simplified. But be a spectator how much he and the progenitor Abraham gave a tenth from the top of the heap, that is to Melchizedek. So we talked about last week. Abram coming from the slaughter of the kings, he fought a battle against kings. He fought against Sodom and Gomorrah, the kings of, no, it wasn't Sodom and Gomorrah. Anyway, he fought against a bunch of kings, right, and to get back Lot's people and their money.
King of Sodom? No,
Right.
Sodom.
Well, I thought, well, Gomorrah, somebody he gave it back to. I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody who was allied with him. But in any case, he went and fought and got back, and this is where he met Melchizedek. So he's got all this plunder that had been taken from the cities and from Lot, and from Sodom and Gomorrah and from Lot. And so he brought it back. And basically, he's offering a tenth to Melchizedek. Now, the important thing to note about Melchizedek is Melchizedek was a Jew? No, he was a Gentile. And we already have the thing about Melchizedek. Now, I want to make it clear. The author of Hebrews was not equating Melchizedek with a god. He was simply pointing out that Melchizedek had the appearance of a god. Who he was pointing out was God is Jesus Christ. That's the relation he's trying to make. So, why could Jesus go into the Holy of Holies? We talked about, I need to draw a picture, right? He went to the Holy of Holies to be the sacrifice and provide the sacrifice. How could he do that? And here's the answer. 5. Kai, and, properly. The law, okay, let me read this in King James. And verily they that are the sons of Levi who receive the office of the priesthood have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law. That is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. Here it is in the, and I want to mention something else before we go on. Okay, so he allowed Melchizedek to tithe, right? To take a tithe. What is the implication of the tithe in this case? So let's say, and I don't think this is that complex, but okay, so let's say that Melchizedek and his people take their tithe. The assumption is that what will Melchizedek do with his tithe? He'll share it with his people. The same thing's true of a tithe of the point. We come now to the specific idea of the priesthood. So it says, Kai, and verily, men, means properly. And properly, they, that's added, R is added, they from the sons, the huios, the offspring of Levi, who lambano, not receive. Remember lambano? I should probably give you that word too. This is a word that, for some reason, lambano. Lambano in Greek means to take. It does not mean to receive. It cannot mean to receive. Lambano is an assertive word, meaning that I am taking it. But for some reason, we want to translate this word all the time into receive. In any case, it says, who take the office of the priesthood, literally, heriateria, that perform the functions of a priest, have or hold a commandment, an intola. 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 Basically, a tola is a telos. An in is a fixed. In telos, fixed telos. Right? A telos is a vanishing point on the horizon. A fixed telos.
There's only one.
It's only one. That's a commandment. That's translated commandment. I kind of like the idea of a fixed telos better than a commandment. That's kind of cool, right? Remember, we're looking for a logos, the telos. A parable has how many? One. Now the Greeks still probably wouldn't call it an intelos. What is an intelos? It's a stated telos. Right? In a normal Greek logos to telos, do you ever tell them what the telos is? No, you would never do that, because why?
To figure it out.
Yeah, Jesus said, hey, I'm telling you a parable. A parable means it has one telos. So guess what? You better get it, right? And whenever he explains it to the disciples, right? Does he ever tell them the telos? No, and you read it and you go, wait a second. He explained it again? Well, we get it, right? I mean, we almost always get the telos of the parables. But the disciples are still like, well, I don't get it. What's going on here? And anyway, I think that's really funny. In any case, so an intelos is a stated telos, which that's why it's translated as command. So have a commandment to take tithes. Apodekatou. Okay, away a tithe. It means literally away tithe or off tithe the people, the laos. According kata down the nomos, the law. Toto, that thing is of autos, of the brethren, the offspring of the same womb. And indeed, kapir, indeed, they come out, ex chromai, come from the issue literally of, from the loins of Abraham. So, here's the translation. I know this gets kind of complicated. And properly, they from the offspring of Levi, who take to perform the functions of a priest, hold a fixed telos, a fixed aim point, a commandment. Away tithe the people down the law, according to the law. That thing is of their offspring of the same womb, and indeed they come from the loin of Abraham. So in other words, what this is saying is, those that are the offspring of Levi, right? They're the ones in the tribe of Levi. You have the tribe of Aaron. The Levi are in charge of the tabernacle and the temple. So their job is to perform the functions of the priesthood. And that's the fixed telos. They were commanded in the Old Testament to take the tithe. Okay? That's the law. And their offspring, the offspring of the same womb, their brothers, not the brethren, that is not their brothers all. The impression that you get from our general translations is they're talking about the children of Israel, right? But they're talking about their brothers. And indeed, they come from the loin of Abraham. In other words, it's establishing a line of ascendancy from Abraham to Levi, who is Aaron, to the priests, right? And the priests take the tithe. Why is the tithe so important? Because the tithe is the covenant meal. The requirement is to take the covenant meal. You tithe the people. You say, okay, here's the tithe. And then the priests cook it, sacrifice it, and share it with people. That's what you do. Okay? The important part of this whole picture, what is the most important part of this whole picture? Out of the tithe comes the covenant meal. Look, okay, I hate to say this, but we've really perverted ourselves within the context of the gospel. Because when we say the tithe, what do we think of?
Bring our money into the church.
Yeah, throw your money, give your money to the church, put it in the offering plate, right? But the concept of the tithe is not that at all. If I were in the ancient days and I would say tithe, what would all your kids do? Yay, we're going to do the tithe. Why?
They get food.
They get food. They get meat. They get real meat. They get food. This is when, and remember I told you, they were, according to the law, they were able to turn the food into money, and then they would go to Jerusalem. And one of the things they bought with that money was they were able to buy beer and buy wine and spirits. And so therefore, remember when Samuel's mother came to the temple and she was praying, because you don't pray in the temple. In the temple is where you sacrifice, right? And she was praying. People didn't pray. Not in the temple. So she's praying in the temple, and the priest says, "You're drunk." And the reason is, it says in Samuel, they were going to the tithe. They were going to the covenant meal, right? So they had come from another area, and they brought it, and they were exchanging their money for the tithe stuff to eat and drink. I mean, do you see how simple it is when you understand some of these like basic kind of things? You go, well, I always wonder why that happened. Well, this is why it happened. I love these little examples because they're always kind of fun to me. It always reminds me of where we are.
Lionel,
Yes,
can
sir.
you stop just a second?
Yeah.
On the covenant meal is shared with the congregation or just the family that brought the tithe?
That is a really excellent question, and we don't know. We're not completely sure.
So in other words, depending on how you're going to answer, did they spread it out, or was it one day or one day a month or whatever? I mean, what I'm saying is there's more than one family in this.
I believe that it was completely shared among all the people. This is the opposite of the Pesach. This is the opposite of the Passover. In the Passover, you each bring a lamb, right? The Passover is a type of covenant meal. In the Passover, every group brings a lamb for a group of people that can eat a lamb, because you have to eat the whole thing. So each group brings a lamb in the Passover, and you don't share it. You share it with that group, but it's sacrificed for you individually, see, for your group.
For the household.
For the household.
Which is representing the angel of death passing over that house.
Bingo, right, exactly. But it's not a shared, it is shared in the context of within that group, but it's not a shared meal. I think I'd be totally right to tell you that as far as we know, and I would guess that the tithe was an entirely shared meal. So you have the very wealthy, for example, bringing bunches of their tithe, and you'd have the poor bringing their tithe, and everyone is communally bringing it. That's why the tithe was tithed by the priests.
So
right?
the tithe is a potluck.
The tithe is a huge, it's a Lutheran potluck.
Yeah.
Well, it's a Pentecostal potluck. It's a Baptist potluck. It's a Catholic potluck. Matter of fact, they did have that. That's the Jewish God. That's what the Jews do. Did you know that? The Jews do basically a potluck, and that's where we all got the potluck from in Christianity.
Well, they did it in Acts. They
Yeah.
brought their food together and they shared it communally.
Well, they still do it today. If you go to a Shabbat meal, you know, they bring the food for Shabbat, and they eat it together as a meal at the Shabbat. And it's a potluck. So, yeah, I think the representation of the tithe is exactly that. That everybody's bringing the tithe in, and they're tithed by the priests, right? And the priests are sacrificing, and then everyone's sitting down and eating of that covenant meal.
Okay, time out.
Yeah.
I'm trying to put this together so that it makes some sense to my feeble mind. I'm not disputing that perhaps it has been perverted, but like what we went through today in the service,
Right.
the tithe or our pledge
Yes.
to the church is shared among the whole church, not
Bingo.
just Naomi and I, not just.
Yes.
Okay, so it is, we don't bring food and have a banquet, but we bring the pledge of financial support.
Yeah, and we all participate in that, whatever it is. For example, the church giving to a missionary, the church giving to the community. We are participating, and we are, by giving, inviting others outside of our own specific community to participate, right? I mean, but the problem is, the difference is this. I think, I'll touch the theological pool. I think that when Jesus and God and everybody's talking about tithing, okay, Their point is we're bringing it in to share together. We're not bringing it to the ecclesiastical authorities so they can go, provide us indulgences or whatever, right? We are participating with the tithe. So that's what makes the tithe important. And I think if I were to write the modern church book about the tithe, I'd say the reason you're bringing your tithe is so that you can participate in the covenant meal. Because we take the tithe and guess what we buy with it? Wafers, wine. We have a place to do, right? We have a place to worship. We have a place to participate. The tithe is the covenant. We are providing for the covenant. And so, to me, and you say, is it semantics? Well, yeah. But yet, how many, I'm not going to say, I know of people that really get turned off the minute somebody starts talking about the tithe, especially at Thanksgiving time. I mean, it's like, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. But, if you couch it in the context of we are sharing together of our bounty so that we can all participate with it.
Well, the covenant is deep.
Yes.
It's not just us participating with God, it is God participating with us. And it is a reminder, and that covenant back in the Old Testament, that was powerful because it was a constant reminder God is going to keep his promises to us, and we must keep our promises to God. And it bound them together. And I think we've lost that in the 21st century. We have a covenant with our holy God, and therefore we must honor our promises to God, and God will honor his promises to us, which is salvation and eternal life.
Well, I'm going to take issue with that statement. That would tend to mean that good works,
No, it doesn't have anything to do with works.
well,
Not at all.
to me, if it is a physical thing we have to do, if
It
we
isn't.
have to honor God, then
It's
we're
a
definitely do something.
spiritual reminder of what God promised from the beginning of time. It's a physical representation of spiritual truth. That's called a sacrament, and we consider our communion to be a sacrament, and it is a physical representation of a spiritual truth. And the spiritual truth is God provided a way of salvation.
Yeah, let me put a context. I think we can, let's reconcile this, but I'll give you another way of thinking about it a little bit, all right? So, for example, we pledge to Christ, let's say. We are convinced about Christ, which means we pledge, in a classical sense, our fealty to Christ, right? We say, we trust in Christ. That's the whole big deal, right? Because we agree with the logic, the argument about Christ, we agree. We pledge our fealty. What does that mean you now have to do? You have to do it. You are required to do what? Because you pledge fealty.
Live for him.
Yeah, well, in the old days, it meant if I pledge fealty, let's say you're the king, right? You're the Saxon king, you're the king of England, whoever you are. I pledge fealty. And you say, you're a knight, right?
You have to lay down your life.
You have to go to battle for them.
That's right. When he calls me, he said, first of all, when he comes to visit, I got to feed him and all his entourage. And number two, when he says, hey, come on, we're going to go to France. I'm like, oh, man. Okay, I'm going to France, right? Honey, what do you want to buy, right? What do you want me to buy when I'm in Paris, right? Ransacking. If he says, okay, we're going to Argenon. I'm like, well, okay, get your bow. Sally, get your bow. We're going to Argenon. The thing is that fealty means, if you pledge your fealty, that means you suddenly owe what? Everything. Your life.
You are bound.
You are bound. And guess what? In the Old Testament terms, we call that a covenant. As a matter of fact, they didn't just call it a covenant in the old times. Guess what they called it when you pledge fealty? You were in covenant with your leader, with your ruler. I actually incorporated this in a book because I thought it was such a really cool idea. I haven't heard it stated quite like this before. In other words, our modern Christian view is, sort of say, okay, I trust in Jesus. Hey, Jesus, the real answer is, I trust in Jesus, and Jesus says, do this, go there, give your life, right? And now you have given your whole life to him. So you say, what's works? The works are
Service.
everything I do in service to Christ and God, right? Everything. Your life should be. That's what Martin Luther said.
Lionel,
Yes,
could
ma'am.
you spell is it fidelity?
F-I-E-L-T-Y.
Oh, F-E-A,
Yeah.
fealty, fealty. I'm
It's a
sorry.
night term.
It's a night term, yeah, sorry.
He likes the nice term.
Well, it's close, but fealty is kind of a classic term when you're a knight or you're a warrior or you pledge fealty to a ruler.
And it's not the same as fidelity.
It could be. It's not the same. It's not the same, but it's a word that's kind of close in its impression or meaning.
But wasn't the division of the animals, I mean, why did they divide the animals? They, God and Abraham, the smoking pot went between there, because there was a maledictory oath. If,
Yes.
Abraham and God was saying, or Abraham was saying, if I don't keep my end of the bargain, then I will be cut up like these animals. It was one of those things.
Yes, that is actually true. And we've lost the concept of a malediction, unfortunately. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't the modern day application of that be with Hitler and Emperor Japan? It seemed to me that both of those required of the population their fealty to the leader.
Well, the emperor, for sure.
And they were
Yeah.
operated as fanatics because of that,
Well, I wouldn't.
especially in Japan.
If you want to take it that far, in a fealty culture, a culture of fealty, there's a name for it. What do we call it? A feudal culture. In a feudal culture, you swear your allegiance to your king, right? And your king, and there's all kinds of rules and stuff. You go through that. It's all ancient. It's great ancient history, and it has some application to the period we're talking about. In the modern era, the Japanese culture was a feudal culture, even up to until the end of World War II, when they were like waxed and then, given a constitution by, what's his name, Westmoreland, whoever was it? MacArthur, yeah. So, by MacArthur. In any case, that was what happened. Now, the Nazis tried to bring back the not Christian feudal, but rather the Teutonic gods. Both of them were, one is kami, one is animistic, and the other one tried to bring back pantheonic paganism. Now the Soviets had a similar, almost feudal culture, but they were atheists. They were bringing, an atheist kind of culture. Christianity within the feudal context is a little bit different, because that's what gave us the medieval era and knights and ladies and eventually the Renaissance. I mean, this can get really deep, because the Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reason, up to our current age. And each of those were progressions. Positive progressions, right? Positive progressions. Because Christianity was kind of and I'm going down a big rabbit hole at this point. So maybe we'll stop the rabbit hole. But anyway, there are huge historical things about this, and it's very important to note. But the most important thing I want you to see is that trust in Christ means a lot, and it's not faith by works, it's works by faith, right?
If you're convinced, this is what you do.
Yes,
Right.
appropriate
Okay,
response.
And you can apply that to almost anything, that it is going to affect your behavior. If you're convinced of this, you will do this.
Yeah.
It's not even work at that point. It's not even an option. It's because you're convinced this is what you're programmed to do. If that makes sense.
Oh yeah, and you see how deep this is? I mean, we are, we go from meta-epithumia, which is a huge concept, which is translated pleasant, right? This ginormous. And I want to mention this one thing. This one thing is, I think, very important. The covenant meal was so important because they ate so little. You're a starvation culture. Your kids barely are getting enough calories to survive. You're not even getting probably 1,000 calories a day. People are skinny as rails. They did not get much food, except when they went to the festivals, and there were sacrifices 6 times a year, remember, for the for the Jews and in the tithing period. So in the tithing period, they finally got their food. It's like Thanksgiving for us, except it was double. It's as if you fasted all year round, and finally at Thanksgiving, you're looking at a turkey, and you're like, I can eat one bite, and that's it, right? Because your stomach is so shrunken. But can you imagine them being able to eat during the tithing period, and all they could want?
Lionel, I've been meaning to ask you this for months. You keep talking about the shepherd culture. Abraham, when he had visitors, he would
Starvation culture. A starvation culture. Yeah.
was Abraham in the starvation
Oh,
culture?
yes. They
Okay.
all were in
So,
starvation culture.
when he had visitors,
Yes.
he would kill a sheep or whatever, and they would have a feast.
Yes.
Okay, did that, and during the Christ time, the shepherds, did their master ever kill a sheep for not a sacrifice?
Oh, number one, you can't kill. Well, the Hebrews had a means of killing animals without sacrifice. They were about the only culture in the world at the time that did, because they had the what? Kosher butcher.
Yeah.
The kosher butcher had been invented. I think I'm an old diaspora guy. I think that the old diaspora, when they set up the synagogues back in the Assyrian era, when they first had the separation, I think that's when they started the kosher butchers, because that's when they were cut off from the temple. Remember, they had two places to sacrifice in northern Israel, and they had one place in southern Israel, but they were restricted. And so sometime in between the diasporas, the two great diasporas, they invented the idea of the kosher butcher. So with a kosher butcher, in Russia or in Greece, yeah, I can have my lamb. But what did the rest of the world have to do? You had to take your pig to the temple of Zeus and have the pig sacrificed for you by the priest, and then you got the leftovers that the god didn't want. And the priest would take their part, and you would take the rest, and you go to the marketplace, because you'd eat what you wanted right on your table, and then the rest would go to the marketplace, and it would be sold to the people.
Another, difference maybe from what Steve's asking and the tithe
Yes.
and the starvation culture is that, yes, when they had their few or rare visitors that would come and they would sacrifice or kill and eat meat, that was just for that guest of honor
Right.
and maybe the men. It wasn't for the entire family, clan, extended, everyone, the kids and the women, they didn't participate.
I mean, I think of the
Well, the
prodigal
leftovers,
son,
maybe.
that
Yeah.
when he came back, they told him to kill the fatted calf.
Yep.
Obviously, he had the resources that he had one.
Yes.
And it's my understanding of the fatted calf is it was kept for special occasions.
Yeah, and do you see, we can assume, there's a couple of things we can assume about ancient cultures. Big things about ancient cultures. We need to think about this. Number one, how often did you have guests? Not very often. Why? Well, even if you could travel,
You had the energy to travel, and you didn't.
well, even if you had the energy to travel, okay. So I'm a Jew and I go to Greece, and what do the Athenian Greece expect me to do?
Worship their gods.
Well, yeah, venerate their gods and be part of their thing, right? And if you didn't do, I tried to put that in the Second Mission. If you ever read my book, Second Mission, the huge criticality that the time traveler tried to tell this accidental time traveler is, you have to do everything exactly correct. When you go into a house, you have to say the right words. When you make a fire, you have to do the right things. If you don't do it correctly, what's going to happen?
Offend them.
You're going to die.
You don't.
The matter of fact, if you ever, there's a book, and I can't find it, I think it got borrowed. One of my children got borrowed my book. I don't know. I had this wonderful book about Japanese culture that was written back in the 50s for Americans going to Japan after World War II. And in it, they listed all the things you could do to offend a Japanese person. When you went into their house, you took off your shoes, right, at a certain place in a certain way, and you said a certain thing coming into their house. When you saw the flowers that they had in the niche, there's always a flower niche that is venerating the gods, by the way, you would say a word. They always have a house altar. You say certain words. There's a return. When you go through a door, you don't step on the door tracks. You open the door a certain way. If you don't follow each of these steps, you offended them. If you lived in feudal Japan, what do you think would happen to you? Right? The samurai thing, and they wouldn't care about the floors. They'd have somebody clean up the mess. You know, our conception is you go to a Motel 6, right? And everybody speaks English and everybody's happy. And even if they don't speak English, you got a phrase book. That's not the way the world works. Go talk to the Amazon tribes and see how easy it is to get in their thing, right? Hey, can I stay the night? You know, like all, you know, that's the way it works. So in the ancient world, guests and travel was not common. It
Well,
was
why would
not-
you wanna travel? All your family and everybody you knew was right here, with you.
Precisely.
You didn't know people or things in other villages or places, let alone country.
And how are you going to eat? I mean, remember, money is not a ubiquitous. You know, our idea is, okay, I got a penny, I got money in my pocket, right? So I can go buy stuff. Look, there's a chance that you go to the village. Now, Nazareth was pretty big, but there's little villages all outside of Nazareth, and you take a coin. What's the chance that they won't accept your coin? Right?
You know, it's worthless to them in some ways.
It may be worthless to them because now if you bring them a Greek silver denarius, they might like, oh yeah, okay, I'll take a Greek silver denarius. Why?
Silver with intrinsic value.
Well, it has intrinsic value, but everybody would take a denarius. But on the other hand, if I bring a Scythian, even if it's a silver Scythian coin, what are they going to do? They say, what is that? What's the value? Yeah, what is it, right? It's a Scythian coin. Where am I? You know, who's going to change this money? Right?
Who establishes the exchange rate? Yeah.
Yeah, the world is, you know, in our world, you go to an exchange thing, you know, in our world, you go to half the countries in the world and you give them a dollar bill and they're like, you know, happy to have it, right? But in the world, you know, it wasn't that long ago I'd go traveling and everywhere I went, we had the potatoes. We call them potatoes because usually the first stop was Portugal and they had pesetas. We go to Azores. We drop into Azores to like get gas, right? And you go to Azores and they had pesetas. So we call them getting potatoes. So every country you went to, you get your potatoes so you could buy something to eat, right? Today, you have a MasterCard. You know, here's my MasterCard, and everybody takes it, and then you get your bill later on with its exchange rates on it, right? So I'm just saying, the world is really different. And you know what? The further we get away from that world, the less and less we're going to understand. That's one of the reasons, well, that's why I think it's great, you know, being able to teach this class, because, you know, we fundamentally dig into these cultures and see what the world is like. Yes, sir.
Just thinking back visually, in the ancient times when it was a starvation culture, were priests easy to spot at a distance because they were the heavy-set guys?
As a matter of fact, Socrates made fun of them in, I think it was Crito. He makes fun of them for being fat, and they took great offense at that. But it was true. What you said is exactly true. As a matter of fact, there are a bunch of ancient documents where the priests are described as, you know, fat or obese or corpulent, you know, including into the Middle Ages. Friar Tuck, right? Remember Friar Tuck? You know, he never seemed to lack for any food. Go back and reread Ivanhoe, you know, and you see that. This is 6. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi. This man is Melchizedek. Did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. So, in 5 it says from Aaron to Levi, or from Abraham to Levi to Aaron to the priests, right? And the priests were tithing. And it says this man, that is Melchizedek, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Here's what it says in the Greek. Day, but he whose, that's cool, descent, gene allegeo, to reckon by generations. Notice a logeo in there, the logical generations. The logical generations is not me, counted genealogeo. From them, autos, deco received a tithe of Abraham and eulogeo, good words spoke of him that had the promises. It's not the promises. See the word? Epangelia. 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 The message from the gods.
Yes, that's message.
The message from the gods. Remember at the very beginning, I got to remind you, the beginning of Hebrews, every time we saw it, they talked about the message from the angels. But all of a sudden it's turned from the message from the angels to the message from, no, it's promises. Well, okay, that's new. The promises, but it means literally the message from the God. Here's the translation. But he who's to reckon by generations, not to reckon by generations. Okay? But he who's to reckon by generations, not to reckon by generations, from them took a tenth of Abraham and spoke well of him that held the message from God. You say, why did the Greeks write it this way? You see what he's saying? He who to reckon by generations, okay? Reckon by generations. Abraham to Levites, Aaron to the priests. Not to reckon by generations. Why not to reckon by generations?
He's not of that line.
Because Melchizedek is not of that line. Not to reckon by generations. This is their use of the lot. They're using logical, rhetorical language. They're using logical language to say it. Took a tenth from Abraham and spoke well of him that held the message from the gods. Remember what it said? It said back in the, when we read the Old Testament, it said that he gave the argument, he gave a logos, he gave a good argument. And I said, what's the good argument? The good argument is the message from the gods. The epangelia we translate all the time as gospel. Boy, you know, I love this stuff. It is so, it is so complex. It's hard to get through this without really digging deep into it. So I'm glad you bear with this, and I hope we are learning something at least about the times and culture and what we're getting at. In any case, thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen.